It's been a full 5 weeks since Jake has disappeared, and Finn has not done much to account for his brother's absence. Cue Jermaine, whose psychic dream link with Jake enables him to realize that Jake is probably in severe trouble, starving somewhere out there in the vastness of space. I was so pumped that we got one last Jermaine appearance before the series comes to a close. I think he's a great character. In the wacky and zany land of Ooh, he's arguably the most down-to-earth straight man out there. He's also just really sweet at heart. I love how he wants to be relied on if either of his brothers find themselves in trouble.
Finn, you know you can call me if you're in trouble, right?
Based on what we saw in Abstract, Jermaine seems to have settled down into a comfortable, happy, and even lucrative life where he pursues his passion of painting. So I didn't expect for him to join in on an adventure, but he does an absolutely outstanding job as Finn's partner. Finn's grandiose trust in Jake has seriously backfired, as it left our hero acting more scatterbrained than usual about the situation at hand. There hasn't been any follow-up communication from Jake, and while Finn may subconsciously be troubled by his brother's sudden disappearance, he has seemingly not done a single thing during the 5-week period to check up on Jake. However, Finn's extreme level of trust is not all bad. It allows Finn to stay calm, collected, and figure out what should be done next. Finn is shocked when he first becomes aware that Jake is in danger.
Jake's in space?
But after that initial shock, Finn returns to a relatively calm state, especially noticeable when contrasted with Jermaine's non-stop nervousness. In fact, Finn even manages to keep a smile on his face as he thinks up a plan to go about getting Jake back, and retains that smile while heading for the Martian transporter powered by love that resides in the basement of Tiny Manticore's house. I mean, I assume Tiny Manticore took over residence of the house, probably without asking, since Normal Man returned to living on Mars. Tiny's got attachment issues. But yeah, while Finn's trust left Jake stranded in space longer than the transforming dog would have preferred, it's also Finn's trust that allows him to stay calm and decide what action to take, because Finn still trusts Jake to be okay until him and Jermaine come to the rescue. As already mentioned, Finn decides to head to Mars to get Normal Man's help, and the ride there was made flippin' amazing due to Jermaine's hilarious scream. Mars was looking pretty decrepit after Grob, Gob, Glob, and Grodd left the planet, but it looks like Normal Man,
Nay, King Man,
or now King Man, rather, has managed to return prosperity to Mars. Although, King Man may have gotten away with his egotism a bit, considering he's building structures in his own image and commissioning numerous statues of Margles, despite there being no real need for them outside of his own personal feelings. Finn quickly runs into another familiar face, and it's of course none other than Betty. I loved their reunion, Betty's strained facial expressions, Finn remarking,
"You slopped up!"
King Man randomly emerging from the pile of sand nearby to tell Finn to take it easy. It was a really fun interaction. Betty's attempt at trying to get better was interesting. Doing a tedious and repetitive task for ungodly amounts of time, like counting the grains of sand on a beach, or, in this case, filling an enormous hole grain by grain, that's a pretty classical sort of punishment in myth and folklore, but it's a strange choice for a cure. I wonder if it wasn't even King Man who came up with the ridiculous task, but rather Betty herself, as a form of self-punishment to make amends for what she's done, and King Man was simply willing to go along with it to see if it helped rein in the magical madness.
If you inflicted it on her, shouldn't you be filling the hole?
Empathy, Finn?
Ah!
I bet when King Man suggested Mars go all in on Margle's iconography, and the Martians asked why, empathy was also his response to them. Seriously though, I'm a big fan of how even without magical madness, King Man is still a lovable and eccentric douchebag. Back when he was still going by Normal Man, he was pretty down in the dumps, so while he was still an amusing character, back then it seemed like he was going straight and trying to avoid nonsense. Turns out, nah, that was mostly just a phase while he was trying to redeem himself, and now that he feels he's found his purpose and got his life together, he can afford to be ridiculous and bizarre again. While Kingman jokes at Jermaine's inability to provide any useful information to help locate Jake, he's already got a retrieval plan in mind. While it's rather convenient that Mars has the perfect object to summon individuals from the vastness of space, Mars was an advanced super society after all. Besides, the journey that's about to take place in the Temple of Mars is going to be an introspective one, where Jake won't even be the focus. After some gonzo comedy in regards to entering the Martian temple, and after seeing that Finn's current hair is in a pretty atrocious state, our motley crew enters the mine maze, and pretty quickly it becomes apparent that Kingman is trying to kill two birds with one stone. As we find out at the end, the temple itself acts as a telemetry capsule, and Finn and Jermaine's thoughts allowed it to pinpoint Jake and extract him, just as Kingman promised. However, the mental shenanigans at play manifested primarily from Betty's psyche, and there's no doubt that Kingman expected as much. He likely used Finn and Jermaine's convenient appearance to try out a new cure for the obsession-based magical madness in Betty. I would imagine sending Betty on her own into the temple would result in disaster for her, or perhaps she would never even be able to make it out. Kingman accompanying Betty might just be even worse. Besides, we already saw the result of what happened when the two tried to work together before. It would not bode well, and I doubt Kingman would want to risk his tuchus when he's got a pretty cushy position running Mars. Finn and Jermaine having their minds dedicated to the task of retrieving Jake, in addition with Finn's familiarity with danger and having a list of heroic accomplishments under his belt, the two would make perfect companions to allow Betty to traverse the mine maze while still managing to return. Kingman, once again, retaining some of the scheming pomposity often exhibited by Magic Man back in the day. He is no doubt providing help, but he's still being a bit of a deceptive dick in the manner he carries that help out. That's awesome. Makes for a very interesting character in my opinion. So, what's the first challenge our motley crew has to surpass? Frogs.
What do you think's going on with all these frogs, Jermaine? Jermaine?
What? I don't know.
Well, I've got what I consider to be a pretty decent hunch as to what it's all about. All of the challenges seem to be revolving around the motif of letting things go and moving on. The frog challenge at the basic level seemed rather simple, as the trick was not to get lost gazing at the frogs, but if you did, simply running for it allows progression to the next puzzle. It goes without saying, the frogs are obviously representative of Ice King. The crown heads are a dead giveaway. Except that one, of course, but more on him later. The only wide-ranging symbolism I'd consider frogs to carry is that of transformation and the state of transience, which is backed up by both their metamorphosis, as a frog undergoes a prominent transformation when developing from its larval tadpole state, and also backed up by the age-old folklore of frogs turning into different things when the proper conditions are met. The fairy tale of the Frog Prince seems rather apt and direct in this sense. Simon has been turned into a debased form, and it's up to Betty to make him transform back to his original self. However, the puzzle in the mine maze is the direct opposite. You have to leave the frogs alone. Making eye contact with these frogs turns them aggressive and creates a wave of angry toothed frogs jumping right at you. This is arguably the most abstract version of the challenges, but they're all revolving around the same thing. It's about accepting that you have to let things go and moving on. Let the frogs stay frogs. If you get invested in them, or give them any attention at all, things will only turn out horrible. It's difficult not to give them attention when they represent your desires. It's easy to get sucked in and lose your sense of self when gazing at the frogs. It happened to Betty, and even Finn to a lesser degree. But you can't become complacent and stationary, you just gotta run along. Run, run, run. Finn's personal frog amid all the Ice King frogs obviously represents Fern, which is also entirely in line with the transformation symbolism. Fern was originally Finn, and now Fern is in an even more transformed state than classic Fern was. Just as the Ice Crown was the corrupting influence for Simon, the emissary from beyond was the corrupting influence for the duplicate Finn. More than anything, though, it's Fern's personality and outlook that has transformed into something vile, and Finn deeply wishes he could return Fern to his pre-grudge state. The frog preys on Finn's guilt and fears regarding the outcome with Fern and how everything went down. Based solely on this moment, it seems like Finn might have to give up on Fern, just as Betty has to give up on Ice King. But as we all should be aware, Betty refuses such a route at the episode's end, so it's likely Finn may do the same. We'll have to see what choices the characters make in Adventure Time's finale. The next challenge of the Mind Maze is a nonsensical math equation on a mass of ice.
I'm not trying to complain or anything, but none of these puzzles have anything
This
to
quadrinomial
do
has been
with
improperly
me.
factored.
Well, that paint palette is probably in the chunk of ice because of you, Jermaine, but otherwise, yeah, Jermaine's mind contributes essentially nothing to the puzzles in the temple. As I mentioned at the start of this video, Jermaine seems to have reached a point in his life where he is content and happy, and therefore he doesn't particularly have any major hangups he has to mentally overcome. The Temple of Mars doesn't draw any of its challenges from Jermaine's mind. Betty is too strong of an influence for that to happen. Which, as far as this challenge goes, I'm pretty sure it's referencing back to how Betty tried to beat the Ice Crown at its game of magical technology when she tried to reprogram the Ice Crown's wish magic. As far as actual math goes, the equation seems to be nonsense, but somebody let me know if there's an interesting Easter egg or something hidden in there. Considering the thing starts with 0 multiplied by an indefinite value, and we're not even dealing with limits, the values appear to all be gibberish. I mean, there's even a straight-up question mark thrown in there. Betty claims to understand what's going on, however, and states that the work already contains errors that need to be fixed. The creature that represents the Ice Crown, which we saw a glimpse of back in the episode Grable's 1000+, which technically happened 1,000 years in the future, this creature changes Betty's changes.
Hey! He's juking the stats!
What?
He's changing the dang numbers around!
He's changing. Oh no.
What I think this means is that no matter what approach Betty tries to take to circumvent the Ice Crown's wish magic, the crown is capable of changing on the fly to keep the status quo. The Ice Crown's magic is not static, but instead a dynamic changing force that's able to create new defenses when threatened, implying that Betty will be stuck at a standstill when trying to combat the crown with her own magic. Finn tries to go after the crown creature, but accidentally breaks its icy perch and careens through the math equation, breaking it and progressing our crew into the next part of the mind maze. Once again, the solution seems to be to not get hung up on what's in front of you and just move past it. Although, this particular challenge does seem like it may have been solved by accident. I'm curious, if our crew tried to pick up the blackboard and simply move it out of the way, if that would have also allowed them to progress. Either way, Finn's audacious actions left quite the impression on Betty. That much was obvious from her reaction at this point, and she later comments on Finn's unrelenting perseverance after they're out of the temple.
Like, did you see Finn in there? He was indomitable. So as I stared into that endless white void, I came up with a plan.
As I said, I feel like Finn's actions were not even the intended solution to this portion of the temple, and yet it still worked, and this served as the primary inspiration for Betty. But I'm getting ahead of myself here and talking about the ending a little too much. Betty still has to internalize the lesson she will choose to reject in the third and final puzzle. I found this one the most interesting as it features Betty from the past before she ever met Simon, interacting with our characters in a semi-omniscient manner. We learn that even before Betty became obsessed with reverting Simon to his original self, she had molded her entire identity around the person of her affections. Betty set aside a 6-month, fully funded research trip to Australia in order to help Simon with his research after only having met him that very same day. She set aside her entire life for him and his body of work, and while this brought her immense joy, it also explains why she can't let go of Simon in the present. Without Simon, Betty feels like she does not have an identity of her own.
Maybe you should try focusing on yourself a little more, you know?
Can I, though? I spent so much time dedicated to Simon, I'm not sure there's even any me left anymore.
It's at this point that past Betty speaks directly to the real Betty and appeals to her desires. This is the only time the temple's mind maze actively tries to steer Betty in the wrong direction, but luckily Finn and Jermaine are there to help Betty see straight.
Even if you are lost cause, she
Or whatever she represents.
is not.
What does the Betty in the mind maze represent? I think it's rather clear this is not the real Betty of the past. Even Jermaine picks up on her being a representation conjured by the temple. Betty does not physically alter the past. Rather, she solves the final puzzle by freeing her past self from the shackles of Simon. The solution is representative of moving on and regaining the sense of self you once used to have. The Betty of the past was her own person and had an identity irrespective of Simon. It's not impossible to regain that sense of self. It's not a lost cause.
Or am I?
Indeed, past Betty, that does appear to be the big question. After Jake is safely retrieved, and after we learn that Finn's wacky head was due to him having lice, Kingman happily congratulates Betty for learning a vital lesson.
That sometimes, for our own good, we must accept the loss of that which we hold most dear.
I've learned that I just gotta work even harder to get it back.
Whether Betty's rejection of the lesson proves triumphant or tragic, I just love that this route was taken. Understanding the lesson, acknowledging the wisdom in that lesson, but then still rejecting the lesson to carve out your own path? That's a pretty flippin' cool sentiment that's not seen too often, and it makes perfect sense for Betty to react this way. Betty's new plan ends on a pretty chilling note.
For me to save my Simon, and for you to finally pull Margles back from the maw of Gulb.
Holy cow, Gulb is nearly upon us. I love how Kingman gulps as a response. He seems unsure what to even think. Kingman is no doubt not entirely over Margles himself. I mean, come on. Margles is to Kingman as Ice King is to Betty, and the lesson he was trying to teach Betty was also a lesson he had to face. Kingman still holds the memory of Margles fondly in his heart and expresses his yearning via the commission of Margles' iconography, but it did seem like he gave up on trying to get her back some time ago. Now that Betty is presenting a chance to get Margles back, Kingman's response is a lump in his throat. He's genuinely unsure what to make of the situation, and I'm very eager to see what his thoughts are after the initial shock expires. This batch of episodes seems to be the very last of Adventure Time we have left before the quadruple-length series finale, so Betty's plan with Gulb might intermingle with the Gumwar plotline that's continued in the following episode, Gumbaldia. I'm very curious how these two events will be handled and what awaits us at Adventure Time's end. I found Temple of Mars to be a fantastic episode, and an excellent continuation to the character arc of not just Betty, but Kingman as well. Magic Man is one of my personal favorite characters in the show, and his evolution into Normal Man and now Kingman has been a fascinating journey to witness. I was glad to see his interactions with Betty, as I felt they had an immensely interesting dynamic ever since You Forgot Your Floaties. Will more madness and sadness await Betty and Kingman in the future, or can they find a happy end? I wait to find out with bated breath.